The friend I had always trusted turned out to have a secret relationship with my wife. Life in the suburbs was a mix of comfort and predictability. My wife, Emily, and I were in our late 30s, living in a quiet neighborhood, where the biggest news often revolved around someone's dog getting loose, or a new fence being installed. Emily and I had been married for nearly a decade, and while things had settled into a familiar rhythm, I never imagined how one of her quirks would push our lives into chaos. Emily had always been fascinated by trashy TV dramas and true crime documentaries, especially the ones about infidelity and betrayal. She claimed they were her guilty pleasure, a harmless way to relax over time. This happened when I was in the first or second year of junior high school. I think I was about 13 years old. I grew up in the countryside. Her interest in these topics had grown into something more at first. I didn't think much of it. It was her version of escapism. But after the big neighborhood scandal, a few months ago, everything changed. It started when our neighbors, the Johnson, became the talk of the block. Mrs. Johnson had discovered that her husband, Mark, had been cheating on her. The news spread faster than wildfire. By the time the dust settled, their divorce proceedings were the centerpiece of every backyard barbecue and book club meeting. Emily was particularly enthralled. She latched onto the story with a level of enthusiasm I hadn't seen before. Every baby shower, potluck, or casual gathering turned into an opportunity for her to dig for new details. I didn't think much of it at first. It was gossip, and gossip dies down. Or so I thought. About a month after the Johnsons' drama hit its peak, I stumbled onto something strange in Emily's home office. She was out running errands, and I decided to tidy up a bit, which usually meant gathering the clutter she insisted was organized chaos and vacuuming around it. While moving some boxes near the corner of the room, I noticed a large bulletin board propped against the wall, turned so it faced away from the door. I hadn't seen it before, and was curious about what it could be. When I turned the board around, my stomach sank. It wasn't a simple pin board with cute family pictures or inspirational quotes. No, it was a full-blown conspiracy board. Pictures of our neighbors were pinned up with strings of yarn, connecting them in patterns. Sticky notes littered the surface, some with names, others with cryptic phrases, like "seen at 800 p.m. possible affair," or "unconfirmed sighting," like something out of a detective movie. Except this wasn't fiction. These were real people. Our neighbors. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It looked like Emily had been tracking the lives of nearly everyone in the neighborhood. Pictures had clearly been pulled from social media, some candid, and others likely lifted from their Facebook profiles. It was surreal. I couldn't believe this was something she had been working on in secret. When Emily came home later that afternoon, I confronted her about the board. I asked what it was and why she had put it together at first. She looked surprised, but then she smiled, like it was no big deal. "It's just a hobby," she said, casually, waving her hand, like I'd found a half-finished puzzle instead of evidence of a suburban spy operation. "A hobby," I repeated, dumbfounded. "Emily, this is insane. You're tracking our neighbors like they're criminals." She shrugged. "It's not that serious. I'm not doing anything with it. It's just for fun. It's like being a detective. You know, a creative outlet." "Creative outlet?" "Emily, this isn't knitting or scrapbooking. You have pictures of people and strings, connecting them, like some kind of investigation." She laughed it off, saying I was overreacting. She pointed out that she hadn't shared any of the information with anyone and insisted it was harmless. "If a man did this, maybe it'd be creepy," she said. "But I'm just having fun. Think of it like art." I didn't know what to say. The whole thing made my skin crawl, but she seemed genuinely oblivious to how bizarre it all was. I told her I thought it was a bad idea and suggested she get rid of it. She promised she'd think about it, but I could tell by her tone that she didn't take my concerns seriously for a while. I tried to push the board out of my mind. Emily's weird obsession wasn't hurting anyone, at least not yet. But every now and then, while cleaning or looking for something in her office, I'd find myself glancing at it. Again. It seemed to grow more elaborate. With each passing week, more pictures, more yarn, more notes. It was like watching a storm cloud build on the horizon. Knowing it was only a matter of time before it broke, the tipping point came. I noticed something new on the board. My picture there. I was right in the middle of it with a string of yarn connecting me to one of our neighbors. Sophia and I were casual acquaintances. We chatted a few times at neighborhood cookouts, but nothing more. Seeing my face on that board made my blood boil. I confronted Emily again, demanding to know why she had added me. She didn't even flinch. "Relax," she said. "It's not what you think. That color yarn is for potential cheaters. It's not like I think you're actually doing anything that doesn't make it better." I snapped. "Why would you even put me on here? Do you think I'm cheating?" "No," she said quickly. "It's just part of the system. I was planning to add myself too. It's just a way to cover all possibilities." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Emily, this isn't a system. It's a mess. You're taking this way too far." She brushed me off again, telling me it wasn't a big deal and that I was overreacting. But I couldn't let it go this time. I told her the board needed to go, or we were going to have serious problems in our marriage. That finally seemed to get through to her. She promised, reluctantly, that she'd take it down. Things were tense after that. I tried to move past it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Emily's hobby was spiraling out of control. Every time I thought about that board, about the strings connecting our lives to those of our neighbors, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Something about it wasn't just weird. It felt dangerous that morning. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I wanted to believe Emily would follow through and get rid of the board. But deep down, I had a nagging feeling that this wasn't the end of it. I just didn't realize how much worse it was going to get. A couple of weeks had passed since I confronted Emily about the board. Things felt strained between us, but I chalked it up to the fallout from our argument. I kept telling myself it was just a silly phase, a bizarre hobby that would pass. She had promised to take the board down. After all, I wanted to believe her, even though I hadn't checked to make sure. Then, one morning, chaos erupted in the neighborhood. Sophia, the neighbor I had been linked to on Emily's conspiracy board, stormed out of her house. Her husband, Michael, trailed behind her shouting apologies. That fell on deaf ears. The entire street watched as Sophia threw a bag of clothes into her car and sped off without a word. The rumor mill kicked into high gear immediately. The story that unfolded was as messy as you'd expect. Sophia had found a bra under the bed that wasn't hers. Michael swore he had no idea how it got there, but Sophia wasn't buying it by lunchtime. Half the neighborhood knew about the bra, and by dinner, the other half did too. Everyone had their whispers about what had really happened. Emily, of course, was over the moon. She was practically giddy with excitement. I came home from work the evening to find her in the kitchen, her eyes alight with what could only be described as triumph. "Did you hear?" she asked, barely able to contain herself. I nodded. "Yeah, wasn't with us. I heard it's all anyone's talking about." She grinned. "You're not going to believe this." She motioned for me to follow her into her office. I hesitated, but she grabbed my arm and pulled me along, like a kid with a secret to share. When we got there, I froze. The board was still up. Not only that, it looked even more elaborate than before. Emily gestured proudly at the tangled web of photos, yarn and sticky notes. Look, she said, pointing to Michael's picture. He was on the board. The yarn connected him to someone. "I told you. It was accurate." I stared at her in disbelief. "You said you'd take this down." "I know," she admitted, brushing off my anger. "But aren't you glad I didn't? This proves it works." The board predicted it. I didn't even know how to respond. I looked closer at the board and noticed something odd. Michael's yarn, which I remembered connecting to another neighbor before, now ended in a sticky note with a question mark. It was the only note like that on the entire board. I frowned. "Wait a second," I said. "This is different. The last time I saw the board, Michael's yarn didn't end like this. It connected to someone else." Emily shrugged. "Maybe I updated. It's not a big deal. It is a big deal, I snapped. Did you change it before or after the scandal started? She hesitated for a moment, then waved her hand, dismissively. Does it matter? The point is, the board was right. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You don't see how this looks either. You changed it after the fact to make yourself look right. Or you somehow knew this was going to happen. Either way, it's messed up. She rolled her eyes. You're being dramatic. No, Emily, I said, firmly. I'm not. This has gone too far. I don't even know what to think anymore that night. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The idea that Emily might have mad at the situation. She wet at me. I didn't want to believe she was capable of something like that. But the pieces didn't add up. I decided I needed to find out the truth. The next day, while Emily was out, I went over to Michael and Sophia's house. Sophia wasn't home. She was staying with her parents, according to the neighbors. But Michael answered the door. He looked disheveled, like he hadn't slept in days. I felt awkward standing there, but I needed answer. Hey, I said. I know this is a tough time for you, but I need to ask you something. Michael frowned. What is it? Did Emily come over here recently? Maybe while I was at work. His eyes widened slightly and he hesitated before answering. Yeah, actually. Sophia asked her to water the plants while we were out of town. While my stomach dropped. Did she go into your bedroom? Michael looked uneasy. I mean, I guess it's possible. Why are you asking? I sighed. Can I see the bra? Sophia frowned. Michael looked confused, but he nodded and disappeared inside. When he came back, he handed me the bra. One look at it was all I needed to confirm my worst fears. It was Emily's. I recognized it immediately as part of a lingerie set I had bought her for Christmas years ago. She'd said it was uncomfortable and never wore it. My mind raced. There was no way. This was a coincidence. I clenched the bra in my hand, anger and disbelief bubbling inside me. Thanks, I muttered, turning to leave. Wait, Michael said, looking panicked. What's going on? Is this hers? I didn't answer. I needed to talk to Emily first. When she came home later that evening, I confronted her. I held up the bra and asked her point blank what was going on at first. She played dumb as a thirst, pretending not to know what I was talking about. But when I pressed her, she finally broke down and confessed. Yes, okay. She blurted out. I planted it. I needed you to see that the board works, that it's not just some silly hobby. I stared at her, stunned. You ruined their marriage. To prove a point. It's not like that, she said quickly. I didn't think it would go this far. I wanted you to admit that I was right. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This is worse than cheating, Emily. You didn't just mess up our marriage. You destroyed someone else's. Do you have any idea what you've done? Tears streamed down her face as she tried to defend herself. But I couldn't listen. I told her she needed to come clean to Sophia and Michael. She needed to admit what she had done and face the consequences. Reluctantly, she agreed. She called Sophia that night and confessed everything. She even sent pictures of the board. As proof, it was a painful conversation. But Sophia believed her. She and Michael started to reconcile. This happened when I was in the first or second year of junior high school. I think I was about 13 years old. I grew up in the countryside. I doubted things would ever be the same between them. As for me and Emily, I didn't know where we stood. I felt betrayed, angry, and completely lost. The woman I thought I knew had done something unforgivable, and as much as I wanted to move on, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of the fallout. In the days following Emily's confession, our marriage was on shaky ground. I barely spoke to her. Then when I did, it was quick and distant. She seemed genuinely remorseful, but I couldn't shake the anger and disbelief. The trust we had built over the years felt irreparably damaged. I spent most of my time at work or out of the house, avoiding the uncomfortable silence that had settled between us. A few weeks later, Emily surprised me with an unexpected gesture. She suggested we go out for dinner. Just the two of us. I want to make it up to you, she said. her voice soft and sincere. I hesitated. A part of me hoped this could be a step toward repairing our relationship. Reluctantly, I agreed that evening. We went to a nice restaurant downtown. It was the first time in weeks that we had spent time together without the shadow of the board looming over us. To my surprise, the night went well. Emily was charming, funny, and seemed genuinely determined to move forward. She admitted that she had started online therapy to work on her issues and promised that the board was a thing of the past for the first time in what felt like forever. I allowed myself to feel hopeful. One thing led to another that night, and we ended up reconnecting in a way we hadn't in months. It felt good. Like was in the first night. Maybe we were finding our way back to each other for the first time in weeks. I went to bed without the weight of resentment pressing down on me. 2 days later, Emily sent me a text while I was at work. "I'm pregnant." The words hit me like a thunderbolt. I reread the message 3 times, trying to process what it meant. Despite everything we'd been through, the idea of starting a family filled me with a cautious kind of joy. Maybe this was the fresh start we needed. I called her immediately and she sounded ecstatic. The next week was a whirlwind. We started planning everything, turning my home office into a nursery, researching baby names and even discussing dates for a baby shower. For the first time in months, we were working as a team. Again, it felt like a turning point, a chance to rebuild what we had lost. But then cracks began to form. Emily told me her first ultrasound appointment was scheduled for a time. I couldn't attend because of work. I offered to reschedule my meetings, but she insisted it wasn't necessary. "It's just the first one," she said. "You can come to the next." I was disappointed but didn't push the issue the day of her appointment. I waited anxiously for an update. Pictures, a call, anything. Hours passed with no word from her when she finally came home. She was quiet and withdrawn. "What happened?" I asked, my stomach nodding with worry. She shook her head, avoiding my gaze. "It's complicated," she said. "Emily, talk to me. Is everything okay with the baby at that?" She burst into tears. I rushed to her side, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. "It's not a miscarriage," she sobbed, "but it's not what we thought." "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. She hesitated, then blurted out, "I've been pregnant longer than I realized, longer than the last time we were together." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What are you saying?" "I don't know," she stammered. "I swear I haven't been with anyone else, but the timing doesn't make sense." I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. "Emily, if you're telling me the truth, then explain how this is possible." "I don't know," she cried. "Maybe the doctor made a mistake." None of it added up. My instinct screamed that something was off that night. After she went to bed, I called the clinic where she claimed to have gone. When I asked them to confirm her appointment and the results, they told me something I wasn't prepared to hear. She had never been there. My hands shook as I ended the call. I didn't understand. Why would she lie about something like this? The next morning, while she was in the shower, I grabbed her phone and reversed image, searched the picture of the positive pregnancy test she had sent me. It was from a random blog post years old. My heart sank. I waited until she came out of the bathroom, then confronted her. "Why are you lying about being pregnant?" Her face went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Stop," I said, holding up my phone. "I called the clinic. You were never there. And this picture, it's not yours. What's going on?" "Emily." She broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said through her tears. I thought it would fix things between us. I thought if we had something to look forward to, we could move past everything." I stared at her, my anger and disappointment wearing with a deep sadness. "You thought lying about a pregnancy would fix our marriage." "I didn't know what else to do," she admitted. Her desperation was palpable, but it didn't excuse what she had done. I told her I needed time to think, then left the house to clear my head as I walked aimlessly through the neighborhood. A million thoughts raced through my mind. This wasn't just about the lie. It was about the pattern, the board, the planted evidence. And now this. Emily's behavior wasn't just reckless. It was destructive. When I returned home that evening, Emily was sitting on the couch, her face streaked with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know I've hurt you. I need help." Her words hung in the air heavy with meaning for the first time. I realized that this wasn't something we could fix on our own. Emily needed professional help, and I wasn't sure if our marriage could survive the fallout. The days after Emily's fake pregnancy revelation felt surreal, like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Every time I looked at her, I saw the woman I had married and loved for years, but I couldn't reconcile that image with the person who had lied to me so profoundly. It wasn't just the pregnancy. It was everything. The board, the bra, the length she had gone to prove some warped point. The woman I thought I knew was unraveling before my eyes. For a while, I buried myself in work. I stayed late at the office, took on extra projects, anything to avoid going home. When I did return, the house was heavy with silence. Emily barely spoke to me. And when she did, it was clear she was walking on eggshells. I felt like a stranger in my own marriage. Then, one evening, she suggested we go to therapy. "I need help," she said, her voice trembling. "We need help." I wanted to believe her, but I was wary. Still, I agreed. We scheduled a session with a couples therapist, and for the first time, Emily opened up about her struggles. She admitted to feeling unfulfilled, like she was losing control of her life. The borderlines. It was all a way to cope with feelings she couldn't articulate. She apologized over and over and promised to work on herself. The therapy session seemed to help, at least at first. Emily started taking accountability for her actions, and I began to hope that we might find a way to move forward. But just as things seemed to be improving, everything came crashing down again. One night, I came home to find Emily pacing the living room, her face pale and her hands trembling. "What's wrong?" I asked, alarmed. "I'm pregnant," she blurted out. I froze. "What?" "This time it's real," she insisted, thrusting a new pregnancy test into my hand. Hence, I went to the clinic today. They confirmed it. My mind reeled. After everything that had happened, I didn't know whether to believe her. "Emily," I said carefully, "you lied about this before. How can I trust you?" Now her face crumpled. "I know I messed up before, but this time, it's the truth. Please just believe me." Against my better judgment, I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt, but the doubt lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. A few days later, I called the clinic to confirm her story, to my shock and growing dread. They had no record of her visit. Once again, Emily had lied this time. When I confronted her, she didn't try to deny it. Instead, she broke down completely. She sobbed uncontrollably, calling herself a monster, saying she didn't deserve the forgiveness. Her breakdown was so intense, it scared me. She locked herself in the bathroom, screaming that she couldn't live with herself anymore. I pounded on the door, begging her to let me in. When she wouldn't, I called 911, terrified that she might hurt herself. The police and paramedics arrived quickly, and they managed to talk her out of the bathroom. She was hysterical, alternating between blaming herself and ranting about how everyone in the neighborhood was a liar and a cheater. It was clear that something deeper was going on. The emergency responders recommended that she be taken to a mental health facility for evaluation. She didn't resist. In fact, she seemed almost relieved, as if she had been waiting for someone to step in and take control. Watching her lead in the back of that ambulance was one of the hardest moments of my life. The days that followed were a blur. I visited Emily at the facility as often as I could. The doctors diagnosed her with a form of delusional disorder, compounded by severe anxiety and depression. They explained that her behavior, the BOR, this happened when I was in the first or second year of junior high school. I think I was about 13 years old. I grew up in the countryside. Even her obsession with infidelity was a symptom of deeper mental health issues that had likely gone unreaded for years. As hard as it was to hear, it also brought a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't just Emily acting out, or being reckless. She was sick. And while that didn't excuse her actions, it made me see her struggles in a new light. Over time, the therapy and medication seemed to help. Emily became calmer, more lucid, and began to acknowledge the harm she had caused. But our relationship was another matter. She couldn't look me in the eye without breaking down, and I didn't know how to bridge the gap that had formed between us. The trust was gone, replaced by a fragile, tentative hope that things might someday be okay. The neighborhood, of course, had its own opinions. The gossip mill spun out of control as word spread about what had happened. Some people were sympathetic, others were cruel. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible to escape the whispers and sideways glances in the end. I realized that staying in the house, in this neighborhood, wasn't healthy for either of us. I decided to move temporarily to give us both some space to heal. Emily remained in the facility, focusing on our recovery, while I focused on picking up the pieces of my own life. I don't know what the future holds for us. Part of me wants to believe that we can rebuild, that this chapter doesn't have to define our marriage. But another part of me knows that some wounds take a long time to heal, if they ever heal at all. For now, all I can do is take things one day at a time. I hope Emily finds peace, and I hope I can find it too. It's not the ending I wanted, but maybe it's the one we need. Here's the next story. The night was hauntingly silent, the type of silence that appeared to hold its breath. Alexander stepped inside the house. His keys landed on mechanical clang that resonated through the silence. It wasn't his typical time to arrive home tonight. He woke up early, motivated by the prospect of surprising Rebecca with a dinner. He planned to prepare himself. After over 20 years of marriage, Alexander believed in fostering their bond. Love, he knew, did not thrive without work. But as he was walking past the living room, something stopped him in his tracks. It was weak, but unmistakable. The sound of soft, familiar laughing came in from the back patio of the house. He recognized Rebecca's voice as light and melodic, and his interest was stirred. Alexander approached his steps, cautious. Another voice joined hers, deeper and with a taunting undertone. Alexander struggled to define it. Was Daniel unreal? Daniel stated with a cynical twist to his tone. The guy gives you everything on a silver platter. Even I am one of the house kids. Alexander frowned, confused, nodding his brow. The words hung heavy in the air, drawing him to the patio door like a magnet. As he got closer, the discourse became sharper, with each syllable impacting with greater clarity. Rebecca let out a joyful and unrestrained chuckle. I understand. Right. It is almost too easy. He had absolutely no suspicions. Daniel smirked. As he added, completely blind. Alexander's chest clenched and his heart thudded with an unexpected fear. He edged closer to the curtain, which parted just enough to reveal the two of them on the patio. Rebecca was lying on the wicker sofa. She holds a glass of wine in her hand. I leaned in, close to Daniel, who was cradling his own drink. With smug confidence, Daniel shook his head, pretending astonishment. After 17 years, he's still clueless. Sometimes, I wonder if he really cares. Alexander froze, catching his breath. 7 years. His mind strained to comprehend the significance of the words. Rebecca swirled her knee gently, a slight smile flashing across her lips. That's because he is very trusting. He's always been like. That's what made everything so straightforward. Her comments hit Alexander like a blow, leaving him clutching the door frame for support. His legs felt weak under him. Daniel chuckled and laid his drink down. The guy feels both children are his. Can you imagine? Alexander's stomach churned and a wave of sickness rose through his children. He felt a piercing agony, just thinking about them. Rebecca smiled wider. He's been a great placeholder, I'll admit. But he was never the right person for this, overly soft and overly naive. That is why I've always needed you. Alexander's world shifted as the betrayal unfolded before him. His instincts told him to burst through the door and confront them. But his body remained motionless, His hands curled into fists, his claws cutting into his palms as he struggled to keep control. Daniel leaned forwards. His tone is becoming more deliberate. Heather, consider telling him the truth at this point. What difference does it make? The children are older, and he will find it out. Eventually. Rebecca shook her head dismissively. Why would I care if he found out? What could he do? Please leave. His entire existence revolves on myself, the children and his career. He is nothing else. Daniel gave a quiet laugh. That is frigid. Even according to your norms. Practical. Rebecca corrected, shrugging. I've tolerated his flaws for years. The least he could do is keep playing his part. It works for everyone. Alexander's vision dimmed as wrath consumed him. He trusted them. Both welcomed Daniel into his house and shared his life with Rebecca. And now he realized how little they respected him. How they had carefully manipulated him. His marriage and his family. It had all been a meticulously orchestrated illusion. Daniel took a slow sip from his glass. Still, you have to admire the effort required to keep this going for 17 years. Rebecca chuckled. Exactly. And it is the finest part. He has never doubted me. He believes everything I say. Alexander couldn't keep listening. The heaviness of their words threatened to crush him. He turned away from the patio. His breathing was weak and irregular. As he stumbled toward the front door, each step felt heavier than the last. His pain and wrath intensified with each step. This was not simply betrayal. The atrocity was methodically planned. Outside, the night air was crisp and cutting, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the home. The faint sound of their laughter followed him as he made his way to the automobile. His mind raced for 17 years. They had made him an idiot that ended tonight standing near the automobile. Alexander clutched the door handle forcefully. His jaw clenched, his knuckles white as he slid into the driver's seat. He let out a trembling breath and said to himself. His voice was chilly and steady. They assume I'm stuck. They have no idea what is coming. As he drove away the house, and the life he assumed he knew vanished into the darkness behind him. The illusion of the last 17 years shattered like glass. 17 years ago Alexander sat leaned over a bar counter at Duncan's pub, drinking a beer after a hard and exhausting week. He was not in the mood for company, but the man who slid onto the stool beside him didn't seem to mind. You appear as if someone kicked your dog, the guy replied with a grin, raising his glass in a casual toast. Alexander couldn't resist a tiny smile. Have you had a rough week? Just work-related stuff. The man clinked his glass with Alexander's. Here's some free advice. Don't overthink it. It's Friday. Forget work for a time. Life is to breathe, not to enjoy. For the first time in days, Alexander felt a genuine smile appear on his face. Alexander presented himself with a kind smile. I am Alexander, he said. Daniel. The other man answered by holding his hand tightly in a firm handshake. That modest exchange signaled the start of a relationship that would deepen over time. Daniel proved to be the loyal, humorous and faithful buddy Alexander had hoped for. The action grew from their common interests, spirited football disputes, furious poker sessions, and mutual rants about their annoying jobs. Alexander first observed Rebecca one evening at Drunkard's pub, where they had a regular meeting. She stepped in with a calm yet powerful demeanor that drew everyone's attention. Wow. Daniel mumbled and nudged Alexander. That person gets people's attention. Alexander laughed nervously. He admitted she's beautiful. Okay. Don't just sit there. Daniel encouraged her and motioned toward her. Go. Converse with her. Alexander hesitated. His nerves tightened. But Daniel shoved him. What is the worst thing that could happen? She says. Her heart isn't thumping. Alexander approached Rebecca, who was standing at the bar, talking to a friend. She turned to face him as he approached, her demeanor open and friendly. Hi. Alexander managed to speak while scratching the back of his neck. May I buy you a drink? She watched him with a sweet grin before nodding. Sure. They struck up a conversation that lasted the entire night, diving into one another's lives with unexpected ease. Alexander told stories about his mundane office work and love of vintage music, while Rebecca enthusiastically detailed her teaching position and ambitions to explore the world. By the end of the evening, Alexander had been utterly fascinated. Their bond grew stronger over the course of several months. Rebecca merged smoothly into Alexander's life. Daniel became a key member of their group, establishing a powerful three. Rebecca admired Daniel's sharp wit, and Daniel frequently taunted Alexander about his luck in discovering her. "You hit the CK pot, my friend," Daniel said over a BBQ in Alexander's garden. "I know," Alexander said, flipping a burger on the grill. "I still don't know how I got so lucky." Rebecca enchanted Alexander's parents from the moment he introduced her. His mother, Bridget, embraced her warmly. "Alexander has told us so much about you," she replied, smiling. "You are even more wonderful than we dreamed." Rebecca flushed. "That is incredibly kind of you." His father, Eric, couldn't resist cracking a joke. "So when is the wedding?" he asked, eliciting a round of chuckles. A year later, Alexander and Rebecca married in a small ceremony, with Daniel proudly serving as Alexander's best man. "She's a treasure," Daniel informed Alexander immediately before the ceremony. "Don't botch this up." Alexander's heart swelled as he looked across the room to Rebecca. "I will not," he promised. Their honeymoon was a dream, and their first years of marriage were full with happiness. They settled into a pleasant suburban home, and Rebecca soon conveyed life-changing news. "You're going to be a father," she said, holding out a positive pregnancy test. Alexander gave her a joyful hug. "This is great." Daniel was among the first to hear the news when he arrived the next day with champagne in hand. He raised his glass to congratulate the prospective parents. Daniel embraced their newborn daughter, Bonnie, like a delighted uncle. He muttered, "She's absolutely perfect." 2 years later, they welcomed their son. Kyle, and Daniel was back laughing about Alexander's increasing duties. "To children under 3. You are officially braver than me." Alexander believed his life was ideal. He had a gorgeous wife, 2 lovely children, and a best friend who was like. However, flaws began to appear in this picture perfect society, which Alexander initially overlooked. One evening, he discovered Rebecca and Daniel laughing together in the kitchen, their heads constricted. "What's so funny?" Alexander inquired, entering the room with a smile. "Oh, not much," Rebecca spoke, hurriedly, stepping away from Daniel another time. Daniel cancelled arrangements with Alexander, only for Alexander to discover that he had been at the house, helping Rebecca fix a faulty faucet. "Why haven't you called me?" Alexander asked Rebecca later. She said, "I didn't want to bother you." Daniel was already here. Alexander ignored these times, believing both of them implicitly. But everything changed. One fateful evening, he sat in his car, raping snatches of conversations, and short moments. Each one is now tainted with suspicion. His palms squeezed the steering wheel as his thoughts raced. Every chuckle, casual touch and apology now felt like part of a wider betrayal. Frustration surged over, and he slammed his fists onto the wheel. The sound of the trumpet broke the night's silence. "How could I not see this?" he growled harshly. Memories that were once treasured were now soiled. He remembered Daniel's late-night visits, Rebecca and Daniel's inner jokes, as well as his parents' anxious glances surrounding him. They all knew. Alexander murmured as the knowledge hit him hard. He unlocked the glove compartment and pulled out an old family photo of Kyle's first birthday. Rebecca hugged Kyle with Daniel standing nearby, his hand resting on her shoulder, and Alexander standing slightly apart, smiling blissfully, ignorant, his eyesight blurred as he focused on the image. "Every single one of you," he said between angry teeth, crumpling the photo and throwing it away. Alexander returned home and sat alone at the dining table, illuminated by a lamp. He put out images, documents, and recollections, attempting to piece together the reality about the life he believed. He knew. Alexander sorted through the mound of memories at a measured pace, his fury seething just beneath the surface. One photograph made him freeze. Daniel clutched Lily as an infant. The similarities between the two were unmistakable. Those deep black eyes, that beautifully carved nose. Alexander's jaw clenched as the understanding crept into his mind. How had I missed this before? He scanned through more photos, each one making his chest tighter. Daniel's presence was inescapable. Smiling, playing games and holding the youngsters scene after scene. It became painfully evident that Daniel had been more involved in his children's lives than Alexander had ever been. And then there was Rebecca. The memories returned in crisp, stinging bits. The late nights, she insisted, worth all work. She maintained that weekends were for girls' getaways, despite the fact that she occasionally resisted his contact. Nonetheless, her face would brighten up any time Daniel entered the room. Alexander's furious, trembling voice cut through the oppressive silence. He grumbled that it had been 17 years wasted. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping on the floor as he pushed it back. Sitting still was not an option. He needed to move in order to do something. He stormed into the bedroom and grabbed a small safe from beneath the bed. Inside were the most important financial documents of his life, including the house deed and a will that left everything to Rebecca and the children. He stared at the pile, his thoughts turning to resolve. They believe I am imprisoned, he whispered aloud, his voice sharpening. They assume I'll just accept it. He took out the papers and threw them all over the bed. His decision is hardening. He grabbed his laptop and began looking for divorce, lawyers, real estate agents, and financial strategies. Alexander wasn't just going to leave. He was ready to scatter the life they had made together his sacrifice. The next morning, he called his supervisor and pretended to be tired. I need a sick day, he remarked. His absence was due to illness. It was the yearning to reclaim control of a life that had slipped out of his hands. His first trip was the bank and he sat across from the manager. Alexander maintained a cool demeanor, despite the fact that he was angry. I'd like to close all joint accounts I have with my wife, he stated, firmly. The manager hesitated, lifting his eyebrows slightly. That is a huge decision. Are you certain? Alexander replied, unequivocally, leaving no space for doubt. Within minutes, the cash were taken from the joint accounts and moved to an account that only he had access to. He contacted a real estate agent. I need to sell my house, he said. Finally, the agent was taken aback. How soon do you intend to move? Immediately, he stated. By the afternoon, Alexander had returned home. The pandemonium of the morning had given him a sense of purpose and a sliver of control. He took out a pen and began writing a letter, while sitting at the dining table. Every phrase was pouring with cold, unadulterated hatred. You've constructed a life around lies. You insulted my trust, love and loyalty. I hope it was worthwhile, because all you've constructed is about to fail. He enclosed the note in an envelope and addressed it to Rebecca. That evening, Alexander stood in the bedroom he'd been sharing with her for over a decade. His gaze traveled over the familiar surroundings, the framed photos in the bed, which had once felt like a haven. Now it was simply another memory of treachery. He grabbed a suitcase and started collecting clothes, toiletries, his laptop and whatever else he needed to start over. As he closed the luggage, his gaze fell on their wedding photograph, perched on the dresser. He lifted it up and studied it with distant coldness before throwing it away without hesitation. Standing at the front door, luggage in hand, Alexander took one final look around the house. It had served as the backdrop to his life for the last 17 years. A home where he raised children, trust, fed his wife, and realized his aspirations. Now it was nothing more than a hollow shell packed with memories, too painful to bear. He closed the door behind him, cursing under his breath. They believe I'm broken. They believe I will stay down. He slid into his car, started it and drove away. The sound of the engine drowned out the storm in his imagination. They have no idea what is coming. The following day, Alexander watched as a real estate agent hammered a for sale sign into the yard. She looked at him, her countenance doubtful. Are you sure you want to move so quickly? There is no rush to sell. There's no reason to wait. he insisted. His tone firm. Alexander walked with mechanical precision. After being listed immediately into the house, the dining table was covered in documents, financial data, deeds, and legal plans. He sat down and opened his laptop. The frigid brightness of the screen illuminated his face as he signed into their shared account. The balance looked back at him. 350 without hesitation. He emptied it and transferred the monies to his own account. Confirmation email arrived very instantly. Alexander leaned back in his chair and exhaled deeply. Step 1, he said to himself. The next morning, Alexander stood at the courthouse counter. The cashier greeted him with a nice grin. What can I do to help you today? I'm here to file for divorce, he explained, handing a stack of completed documents across the counter. She thumbed over the documentation and nodded. You have everything in order. Grounds, the division of assets, custody. Are you totally certain? Yes. Alexander spoke in a firm voice. The clerk stamped the paperwork. She'll get served in a few days. Alexander leaned in gently. Make sure she receives them at home. I don't want any possibility for misinterpretation. Back in the house, Alexander went around the rooms, like a ghost, gathering his last items. His luggage sat open on the bed, half full of supplies. He packed carefully, taking care not to leave anything valuable behind as he zips it shut. He took one final look around the bedroom. This was where he had imagined, planned and loved it was. Now, just another room in a house he wished to leave behind. The portrait on the dresser attracted his eye. Rebecca's dazzling smile shone, as she clutched to him with the tenderness that once seemed irreplaceable for a brief while. A surge of feeling emerged, possibly grief, or even regret. But suddenly, the recollection of her harsh comments to Daniel struck through Luza. She had scoffed with contempt. He reached out and briefly held the photo in his hands, allowing the weight to anchor the rush of recollections. Then with a single determined action, he smashed it in half and hurled the fragments into the trash. By lunchtime, Alexander sat at the kitchen table, a pen poised over a starkly blank sheet of paper. What could you possibly say to someone who had ruined everything you previously held? This happened when I was in the first or second year of junior high school. I think I was about 13 years old. I grew up in the countryside. Following a lengthy interval, the pen moved. Every stroke was purposeful. His handwriting is strong. You constructed your lives around lies now. Watch them disintegrate. He carefully folded the note, placed it in an envelope, and wrote Rebecca's name in large, uncompromising characters across the front. 2 days later, Rebecca was standing in the kitchen, pouring coffee into her favorite cup. Can you grab it when the doorbell rings? She called over her shoulder to Daniel, who was sped on the couch. Yeah, certainly, he said, setting down his drink. He returned moments later with a bewildered expression. What is it? Rebecca inquired, noting the papers in his hand. Did someone serve you? Daniel explained, handing her the stack of documents. Rebecca scowled and put her coffee aside as she scanned the pages. Her face blanched. Divorce paperwork, she whispered. Disbelief gripped her voice like a second skin. What? Aaron straightened. Instant alert. Rebecca dropped the papers on the counter, grabbed her phone and dialed Alexander's number. Every attempt had the same result. She dialed voicemail, becoming increasingly anxious with each failed effort. What's this? He did not even speak to me. He's just filed, she exclaimed. Daniel paced the kitchen floor in frustration, picking up the discarded papers and skimming over them. He plainly stated that it appears he is also selling the house. What? Rebecca froze in mid-EP. Her breath caught in her throat. Daniel pointed to a part of the paperwork right here. He's liquidating everything. Her voice quivered as panic seized over. He can't do it. See any? Daniel shrugged before he could react. Rebecca W.H.'s gaze fixed on an envelope on the counter. What is that? He inquired. Without responding, Rebecca tore it open and unfolded the message. As her eyes scanned the contents, her hands trembled. You constructed your loves around Lies now. Watch them disintegrate. Daniel's voice interrupted the silence. What does it say? He inquired cautiously from behind her. She handed him the note without saying anything more. Daniel. Read it. His jaw tightened as comprehension dawned. He knows he spoke evenly. Rebecca fell into a chair and buried her face in her hands. This is not occurring. He cannot just leave. Daniel leaned on the countertop, arms crossed. Looks like he's already gone far away in a dimly lit motel room. Alexander's phone buzzed constantly. Rebecca's name flashed across the screen repeatedly. He glanced at it, but did not respond. Instead, he turned off the phone and laid it aside. Looking out the window to the darker horizon, his chest began to feel surprisingly light. For the first time in years he felt liberated. Years later, Alexander adjusted his tie. In the mirror of his large office, sunlight flooded in through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the colorful cityscape outside. It was a sharp contrast to the small-town life he had left behind. His gaze shifted to the polished nameplate on his desk. Alexander Scott, the founder and CEO. A small smirk appeared on his face. Not bad for a loser, he said. The journey to this point had been arduous. The early months were a flurry of emotional turmoil, and intense self-discovery therapy sessions forced him to face the depths of betrayal and anguish he had hidden during one of these sessions. Drive Sullivan asked a question that stayed with you long after you'd forgotten about what you lost. She had observed. Had you considered what you've gained? Alexander scoffed furiously. Gained? I lost my wife, best friend and family. Everything I thought mattered. Her steady stare did not waver. You've achieved your independence. You have escaped the lies. Now you have the opportunity to something authentic. Her remarks struck a deep chord with him, gradually shifting his perspective. They eventually became a hushed mantra. Alexander left his hometown behind to start over in a vibrant city. He used the money to withdraw before departing. He founded a small marketing agency that prospered, despite the odds, growing into a successful business with high-profile clientele and achievements. The healing process extends beyond work to years into therapy drive. Sullivan mentioned the possibility of dating again. Had you exploring new relationships? She inquired gently. I'm not ready. Alexander reacted by shaking his head. You might surprise yourself, she added with a knowing smile. Alexander gradually made new contacts. Though he had not found love, he did discover connections based on respect and true caring things he once thought were unreachable. Rebecca and Daniel's lips fell downward as Alexander's climbed. One afternoon, Alexander received an email from an old acquaintance back home. The subject line read, "You won't believe this." Intrigued, he opened it and discovered a link to a local news item. Daniel's firm had collapsed amid suspicions of fraud, leaving him in debt. Alexander reclined back in his chair and read, quietly, satisfied. Kona, he grumbled to himself. Rebecca was struggling to make ends meet with a menial job. According to the acquaintance, her once perfect reputation had been shattered by Alexander's sudden departure, and the village had abandoned her. A short feeling of pity arose, but it was swiftly replaced by the remembrance of her betrayal. Alexander closed his laptop that evening and looked out the window of his high-rise flat at the city lights. A calm smile replaced the bitterness that had once engulfed him, bringing him deep serenity. He raised his glass to the gleaming skyline. You built it, he told himself, and no one could take it away. Alexander got out of his sleek black car. His footsteps echoed forcefully on the pavement. The town itself seemed trapped in time, changed in its peaceful simplicity. But Alexander was a different man now, with little resemblance to the person who had left this spot 6 years before. His tailored clothing fitted like armor. His gold watch gleamed in the sunlight, and he emanated a calm authority that demanded attention. Without hesitation, he walked toward the diner on Main Street. The focus of local gossip conversations came to a halt as soon as he walked in. A ripple of recognition spread around the room. Curious whispers replaced the banter. Is it Alexander Scott? Where has he been all these years? Alexander strode to the counter, with controlled grace, ignoring the murmurs from the audience. Sandy. When the waitress's gaze fell on him, she stopped dead. Alexander, she exclaimed, her voice husky with surprise. It's been a while. Sandy, he said, with a courteous, yet distant smile. A black coffee, please. Her hands trembled slightly as she filled the cup. We all assumed we would never see you again. You have changed. He offered a tiny nod and his smile faded. 6 years has a way of doing this with his coffee in hand. Alexander took a seat by the window, calm and unconcerned. He browsed through his phone, while the diner buzzed with curiosity about his unexpected reappearance. The news quickly traveled throughout the community. Within minutes, texts and phone calls spread the news to everyone, including Rebecca and Daniel. Rebecca was in her modest apartment when her phone vibrated, indicating a message from an old acquaintance. Alexander. He's back. He's in the diner, and he looks different. You need to see this. Her breath caught when she read it. Unease tightened her chest. Alexander. She muttered aloud, a phantom haunting her from the other room. Daniel's voice rang out. What is wrong? Rebecca didn't respond. She grabbed her handbag and dashed out the door, disregarding his perplexed looks. Meanwhile, Daniel's phone buzzed with its own message. Alexander. Scott is returning. I can't believe he would show his face. After all this time. Daniel froze as dread twisted in his stomach. His mind flashed back to an old, unpleasant memory of a letter written with rage. Now, watch as they crumble. Daniel reached for his keys, muttering to himself. This cannot end. Good. By the time Rebecca arrived to the diner, Alexander had disappeared though. His presence remained in the low hum of murmured talks. Rumors swirled about her. Did you see the car? What do you believe he is here for? Rebecca's hands trembled as she ran back outside. When she got back home, Daniel was pacing the living room. Tension was engraved on his face. Come back, she replied softly. I know, some at first, Daniel responded, his voice stinged with anxiety. But why? Now Alexander already knew the answer over the last few months. He had methodically found every secret Rebecca and Daniel had attempted to conceal using private investigators and old contacts. He had compiled a scathing dossier detailing uneconomic failures, Rebecca's stagnating career, and the awful reality of their betrayal alone in his motel room. He sent an anonymous letter to the local press carefully detailing their wrongdoings. It was accompanied by indisputable proof, including photographs, documents, and even DNA tests. He sealed the envelope with finality and spoke to himself. Let the games begin. Again? The reunion Alexander had planned took place days later at his parents' house. His mother eagerly answered his phone. She was thrilled at the prospect of reconnecting with her estranged son. Rebecca and Daniel arrived on edge, rumors about Alexander's motivations nagging at them. The dinner table was a feast. Nonetheless, the mood was weighted with anxiety. Alexander sat at the head of the table. His calm appearance concealed a smoldering intensity. Rebecca avoided his sight completely. Her hands were clutched tightly in her lap. Daniel fidgeted anxiously and scarcely ate. Alexander's father attempted to relieve the atmosphere with a forced cheer. It's nice to have you back. Son, you have done quite well for yourself. That business of yours, it's remarkable. Alexander smiled softly, but it did not reach his eyes. Starting anew can feel freeing. Daniel cleared his throat awkwardly. So what brought you back? Alexander sat down his glass and leaned forward. His gaze. I see closure, he stated. Frankly, the word froze the entire room. His mother threw out a nervous laugh. Closure? That sounds serious. Yes, Alexander replied, sharply reaching for a heavy folder at his side. He placed it on the table with a purposeful thump. The noise sounded like a thunderclap amid the tense silence. What is that? Daniel asked tearfully. His voice was strained with anxiety. Evidence. Alexander spoke harshly. Evidence of what you guys have done to me. His mother's face was robbed of color, Sam, please. What exactly are you talking about? Without saying anything, Alexander opened the folder and slid the contents across the table. Photos, financial records and DNA findings poured out of each piece. Alexander declared a dagger of truth, holding up a single document. This proves that the children I raised are not mine. They are yours, Daniel. Rebecca gasped, her face crumbling and tears welling up. Alexander, allow me to explain. Don't. He snapped and silenced her. His attention turned to Daniel. His voice was low and nasty. You are my best friend. Daniel, you've betrayed me for almost 2 decades. When he turned to face his parents, his look was merciless. And you've known the truth all along. You allowed me to live a lie. Alexander's father bowed his head in shame, while his mother stammered. We believed it was for the best. We didn't want to harm you for the best. Alexander's voice cracked with wrath for whom? Definitely not me. The room fell into an impressive quiet. Alexander's revelations hung in the air, a final reckoning that broke their family's delicate illusion for them. There was no turning back. The elder man looked at Rebecca, his eyes full of unsaid inquiries. Her lips quivered, tears welled in her eyes, as she strained to make words. It is not that straightforward, she eventually murmured. Alexander's voice cut through the tense atmosphere, like a dagger. No, Rebecca. It's simple. Daniel is your real father. I was simply the who raised you. The place erupted into turmoil. The adolescent screamed, furious, perplexing questions at Rebecca and Daniel, as Alexander's parents attempted miserably to calm everyone down in the chaos. Alexander's voice came out, so powerful and fierce that the room fell, hushed, beneath the weight of his authority. He stood, his gaze icy and steady. He responded, You all have lied to me for years. His comments were measured, but filled with wrath. However, the lies have come to an end. Everyone in this town is going to learn the truth. Rebecca collapsed on the floor, sobbing. Alexander, don't please. I realize I made mistakes, but I loved. You love me. Alexander laughed sharply and bitterly. No, Rebecca. You enjoy the life I gave you. Not me. Daniel stepped forward. His hands rose in emotion, intended to comfort Alexander. That's enough, he whispered quietly. Alexander's glare was sharp. Don't tell me when it's enough. You have already shattered my life. Now you must face the consequences. He turned to his parents, his voice husky with hate. You stood by and defended lies, rather than protecting your own son. Don't believe I'll ever forgive you. Without saying anything else, Alexander walked away, leaving behind a devastating family, a home filled with sadness and the overwhelming weight of remorse. The knock at Alexander's office door was timid, almost imploring. He did not look up from his laptop. He did not need to. The receptionist had previously warned him. Have they returned? She had spoken quietly. Let them wait. Alexander had responded as why. After nearly an hour, he motioned for his aide to let them in. Rebecca was the first to enter. Her appearance was a ghost of the polished image she had portrayed. Her hair was unkempt. Her garments hung loosely around her tiny frame. Daniel's normal confidence faded into a disappointed slump. Alexander did not bother to stand. He leaned back in his chair. His face was an inscrutable mask. Rebecca's voice cracked when she broke the stillness. Alexander, we should chat. He repeated her comments with a scathing, contemptuous tone. What else could you say? Daniel went forward, hands raised in submission. Look, we understand. We made a mistake. But this has gone too far. You have destroyed everything. Alexander lifted an eyebrow, his words low and sharp. Everything was destroyed. That's impressive coming from you. That is exactly what I thought 6 years ago. I discovered that the two of you had been tearing my life apart for 17 years. Rebecca sobbed. Sam, please. I am imploring you. I know I do not deserve your forgiveness, but the children are suffering. They cannot comprehend why this is happening. Alexander's jaws constricted. His voice was poisonous. Don't bring the kids into this. You lied to me about them throughout their lives. You exploited me as a fallback plan while playing happy family with him. Behind my back. And now you want to discuss suffering. Daniel's voice cracked when he tried again. Alexander. We are ruined. I have lost everything. My business and my reputation. People will not even glance at me. You have made your point. Can't we just go on? Alexander rose hastily, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He stepped around his desk, his presence hanging over everyone. Move on, he repeated in a deadly whisper. You ridiculed me for 17 years. I was called clueless. Your lids are built on my trust in money and love. And now you seek mercy. Rebecca sank to her knees and clutched his hand. I was mistaken, she sobbed. I was selfish and blind. And now I've lost everything. Please, Alexander, stop. We can no longer handle this. Alexander wrenched his hand to escape his sight. I stalled. You didn't consider what I could handle when you were sneaking around with him, he explained. You didn't mind what I was losing. When you laughed. Behind my back. So no. Rebecca, I will not stop. Daniel's irritability boiled over. This is purely vindictive. You are penalizing us for a mistake. Alexander's eyes blazed with rage. An error. Daniel. 17 years is not a mistake. It is a decision. A decision you made every day. While I rested. You don't you dare lecture me about punishment. You have only just begun to pay for what you have done. The audience fell silent as Alexander's voice softened. But his fury remained obvious. Do you want forgiveness? He requested. His words as if they were stolen. Earn it. Don't expect it. Not now. Perhaps not a... Alexander walked out of the room, not looking back. Rebecca sobbed at his feet, while Daniel stared blankly at the wall. Alexander sat silently at a little cafe. His hands were clasped around a warm cup of coffee. It was one of the few locations where he could feel at peace with the world. But its complexity seemed distant. He hadn't intended on meeting anyone that day. Not to mention someone like Nora. She entered the cafe, juggling an enormous stack of books and a coffee slip before reaching the counter. The books stumbled from her grasp, spreading around. Without thought, Alexander got up to help. Thanks, she said, pushing a strand of hair away from her face. I really need to quit pretending to be able to take a library with me everywhere. Alexander gave her the last book. His lips formed a slight smile. Sometimes a little additional weight is worthwhile. She laughed. Softly. True. My arms might disagree. They may have parted ways, leading only to strangers, experiencing a momentary interaction. Alexander was drawn to Nora. For some reason. She wasn't attempting to impress anyone. And it could have felt unusual, even disarming. When her name was called for her order, she paused before returning to him. If you're not in a rush, she said with a modest smile. Do you want to join me? I could use a break from all the reading. Alexander raised his brow amused. You're asking a stranger to help you procrastinate exactly. She replied with a broad genuine grin. For the first time in years Sam laughed for an hour. Their talk ebbed and flowed, naturally, alternating between profound and amusing exchanges. Nora, a freelance editor who is genuinely passionate about books and narrative, exuded calm confidence. Despite her overall reticent demeanor, her enthusiasm for certain subjects lit up her face. And Alexander, and you both saw it, she asked, tilting her head as if she could see straight through him. You have a green demeanor, yet there's a weight to you, as if you've borne more than your fair share of burdens. Alexander halted, surprised by her intuition. Is this that obvious? He responded, a tiny smile pulling on his lips. Not really, she said, taking a cautious drink from her coffee. I'm just good at reading folks. However, you are under no obligation to divulge anything unless you wish to. For the first time in years, Alexander felt at ease. He did not provide every detail, but he did provide glimpses into his story of betrayal, rehabilitation and rebuilding. Nora listened with calm attention, never interrupting or asking for more than he was willing to share. You've been through a storm, she remarked quietly, her tone warm. Nonetheless, you persevere. This is something to be proud of. Alexander experienced a fresh and unusual sensation of being understood without judgment through her words. Over the next few weeks, their encounters became a regular part of his routine. Quick coffee breaks morphed into dinners, which led to late-night tears down quiet streets. Nora never pressed him, but Alexander developed an unanticipated yearning to open up more one evening while walking along. On the riverbank, Alexander came to a halt and turned to face her. You know, he added, his voice calm, yet vulnerable. I never imagined I'd trust anyone again. But you've taught me that not everyone wants to harm me. She met his gaze. Her smile was firm and encouraging. And you've taught me that it is possible to rebuild no matter how difficult the past has been. It doesn't matter where you've been. It's all about where you decide to go. In that moment, Alexander recognized he wasn't simply moving forward. He was finally letting go of the sorrow he had been carrying for so long. Years of bitterness and self-doubt faded away, leaving behind a sense of liberation he hadn't felt in years. 6 years ago, Alexander confronted the horrific lies that had appended his life. Rebecca and Daniel had watched their once privileged lifestyles unravel in the intervening years. Rebecca struggled to find steady work following the affair, constantly trying to make ends meet. Her once pristine reputation now follows her like a black shadow. Whispers followed her everywhere. She left, and the community that had accepted her before regarded her as a warning about what happens when trust is betrayed. Daniel's fall was as steep. His company had crumbled as a result of his dishonesty. Despite him once being a star in business, his reputation was in shambles and previous allies kept their distance. Every new enterprise failed, and he resorted to drink for comfort, only to find himself sliding deeper into depression. Their children, now teenagers, carried the scars of a broken household and the loss of the illusions they once held. Alexander, on the other hand, had carved out a fresh path. He constructed a life based on truth and meaning. FUL relationships with Nora as his faithful partner. They embraced new experiences, such as traveling and discovering activities that provided them joy and contentment. One tranquil Sunday afternoon, while they rested on their balcony, Alexander's demeanor became distant. Are you still thinking about? Nora inquired, kindly. I can tell his mood has shifted. He stated that sometimes his voice was introspective. It's hard not to, but I've learned a lot about trust in myself. She grabbed for his hand and her contact grounded him. As a result, you've gained strength. That is what matters. He nodded, grateful for her ongoing support. There was a point when I believed I would never get over it. Now feels like just one chapter in a much bigger saga. On the anniversary of his parents' deaths, Alexander went to their graves for the first time in years. Standing in front of the tombstones, he experienced a flood of recollections. They loved him and made sacrifices for him. This happened when I was in the first or second year of junior high school. I think I was about 13 years old. I grew up in the countryside. They were no longer with him. Their impact continued to shape who he became. He kneeled down and laid a single white flower at their grave. I'm not sure if you ever really understood me, he mumbled. His voice was steady and calm. But I've learned to understand myself. I've relearned to trust both others and myself. And I'm free now. I have. Let it all go. A gentle touch rested on his shoulder, and he looked up to see Nora standing next to him. Her presence provided consistent comfort. I am proud of you, she replied, sincerely. Her speech was laced with quiet confidence. Alexander smiled, experiencing a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. The past would always be with him, but it no longer held him captive with a final gaze at his parents' graves. He turned towards Nora. Let us go home, he urged. They went away together, leaving behind the weight of his previous scars. Alexander had merely defeated Rebecca and Daniel. He had overcome the inner struggles that had previously overwhelmed him. He had finally discovered peace, and with it, a deep and lasting happiness. My buddy, thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed listening, Please like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Also, leave a comment below to share your thoughts on what happened.